By the end of the 1980s, the Hawke Labour government was set on destroying the free university education that had been introduced by the Whitlam Labour government in 1974. Bob Hawke and his treasurer Paul Keating came to office in 1983 committed to what we now call neoliberalism, increasing the profits of Australian capitalism by weakening the union movement and holding down real wages, gifting profits directly to private capitalists through privatisation, and shifting the costs of welfare and education from corporate taxpayers to consumers, in other words, onto the backs of workers and students. The first attack on free education came in 1986, when Labour introduced a $250 so-called administration fee charged to students on enrolment. It was the thin end of the wedge. There was a stock market crash in 1987, followed by bankruptcies among banks and finance firms. Most people didn't realise it, but Australia and the world was on the brink of what Keating infamously called the recession we had to have. Hawke and Keating sharpened their knives. In 1989, Labour introduced HECS, now rebranded as HELP, meaning students were now paying part of the cost of their education. A year later, Labour gave universities the go-ahead to charge upfront fees for some postgraduate courses. There were student protests of thousands, including occupations, and it's in this context that in 1992 Labour signalled that it would hack into Austudy, which was already set at a derisory level. "You can't feed a dog on Austudy" was the common slogan. Thousands of students took to the streets. In Melbourne, the police counterattacked by arresting 5 members of the International Socialist Organisation, a predecessor of Solidarity. It took more than 2 years, but a significant defence campaign led to all the major charges being dropped. Among the 5 were Marcus Banks and Jonathan Sherlock, and we're talking with them today. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Narm, or Melbourne. So welcome, Jono and Marcus.
Thank you.
Hi, David.
Look, you were both on the mass student rally that marched on Parliament in March 1992. Jono, you were at the University of Melbourne, so you can tell us about the mood amongst students. Marcus, you were a public servant. Were workers sympathetic to the students' demands?
To understand the mood among students, we need a little bit of context. In 1990, a corrupt Labor-run bunch of officials were removed from the Student Union office by a left-wing campaign. And in addition to that, a bunch of activists headed up to the Australian International Defence Exhibition, a demonstration outside Canberra. And a lot of activists, including myself, cut their teeth on anti-war activism at the time. And so heading towards the beginning of 1992, and the attacks on Austudy were announced, it was almost a reflex action that left-wing activists would get together. We formed a group, the Education Action Committee, and we started planning action. The meetings were fairly substantial from the get-go, and once we unpacked what the attacks on Austudy would really mean, we started building on the anger among students to call students out. And on the day, in fact, the contingent from Melbourne Uni was easily the biggest contingent as it marched down from the university down to, it wasn't Federation Square, it was the City Square at the time. And the movement was lively and vibrant and very clear on why we were out there and why the attacks on Austudy should be stopped.
And Austudy was set at below the poverty line. How important was it for students? Were they protesting on a matter of principle, or did it really go to their ability to continue to be students?
Both of those. So for me, someone who was living at home with my parents, and Austudy's income was income tested. Youth allowance is still income tested against your parents, whether or not you live at home. There was not exactly poverty affecting me, but on a matter of principle, I could see I had friends who relied upon income support supplemented maybe by work in order to live. And certainly if you wanted to live near the Melbourne University campus, even in share housing at the time, it took a substantial fraction of your Austudy payment just to live. There were, I remember at the time, and I'm not sure if it was before or after, one of the student newspapers, it might have been Monash, might have been Farrago at Melbourne Uni, published How to Shoplift If You're a Student article, which was very provocative. And although I think the author at the time confessed it was a bit of a provocation, they were making a serious point. Students had to do fairly desperate things routinely to survive, including sometimes going to food banks. And so although not all students are affected by poverty in the same way, a lot of us thought on principle students should be able to live reasonably independently. We don't have to be wealthy, but we'd like to pay the rent and put food on the table.
So Marcus, how big a deal was this for workers?
Well, I was working at the Brunswick Commonwealth Employment Service in Sydney Road in Brunswick at the time, and the CES was the best unionised department, section of the Department of Employment, Education and Training, and also in the whole public service at the time. And Brunswick CES in particular was 100% unionised, and the approach by the members, we had a political approach to life and to work and to society at the time. I had the Nicky Wimmer picture of him, the famous one, the footballer pointing to his chest to say he was black when he was racially abused at a Collingwood game up there. And, we'd talk about racism and sexism and stuff. The members were involved in campaigns already. The Brunswick Community Health Centre was threatened to be closed down, and members at both the Brunswick and the Coburg Commonwealth Employment Services joined the campaign with unemployed people in the area to defend that. We helped publish in 5 different languages leaflets that we jointly handed out the front of our offices to people coming through. And if you remember at that time, unemployment was quite high. And I'd been to ADEX as well, and 200 people had been arrested there, and there were 2,000 people at the arms exhibition that was occurring in Canberra at the time, and I came back and told people what was going on and how everything went. So, it was quite a political workplace. And I was the secretary of the Combined Delegates Committee for Victoria, and we consistently put up motions and support for campaigns and, solidarity motions and things like that. So with the attacks on Austudy, because our department in Employment, Education and Training, along with Department of Social Security, co-managed Austudy, and so we could see, the poverty that students were in and the incredible bureaucracy that students had to go through to even get a dollar out of these departments.
Okay, so thousands of students and people like yourself, Marcus, and I was there as well for the record, marched on Parliament that day in March 1992. Paint a picture of what happened. Initially it was a march, but obviously it turned into something quite different.
All cards on the table, we were going to do something on that day from the get-go. So we listened to several speeches at the City Square, and one of those speeches suggested that when we get to Parliament, we're not just going to sit there passively and listen to more speeches, we're going to do something. And the march took the standard route now down Swanston Street, Nutburg Street towards Parliament. Very lively, loads of chanting about free education, about Austudy being livable. I've forgotten the exact slogan, but those chants were constant and lively. We get up to Parliament and there's a thin line of police protecting Parliament, and we started charging up through them. And there's no assaults taking place. We're pushing past them or going through gaps, and the police are trying to, And about 100 of us got to the top of Parliament steps, and it's quite a vision when you look back down. And in all of the tenseness, I have to confess, I got to the top, and I actually vomited at the top of Parliament steps. But we look back, and you see this line, and you realise how thin it is. So we started calling to everyone to come up, and then something just triggered the crowd, and they all took the decision at once. And an age photographer took what's now a famous photo. I've still got the poster at home of that moment when a bunch of people burst up through the police lines. We occupied those steps and listened to further speeches, getting the sound truck and so on. That was organised, and people made further speeches about Austudy. And in the midst of all of that, the police arrested 4 people from the crowd, pretty much at random, and threw them in a brawler van. And one of those people, Toby was his name, was the secretary of the NUS Vic branch, I think, or the federal branch. And we'll come back to that because he was a public figure they arrested. One of the speakers at the front said, "The police have just arrested 4 people. We're not going to stand for that." So the whole crowd, as one, just shifted to the brawler van, which was heading north along Spring Street, surrounded it, and people got materials from local building sites and built an improvised barricade. We surrounded the van and forced it to stop. People were rocking the van, constantly chanting, "You let the prisoners go, we'll let the van go." And after several hours of this, add at this stage, the police response then was nasty. People were choked, punched, and the police, bizarrely, a couple of them climbed up on top of the van to look at the situation. After it settled down for a while, we settled in for a couple of hours, of stalling that van. In the end, the police did make the decision, the commander on the spot made the decision to let the 4 people go, to much cheering and applause, and of course then we marched off back to the city square. Now, one of the people arrested, Toby, later offered himself back up to the police rather nervously, because the police had said publicly later that there's no possibility of tracking any of the 4 people they'd arrested, which was just rubbish. That night on the news, the commander in charge of the local police force, who I got to know because he testified against us at the committal hearing later, said that we're going to get those responsible, and that the industrial socialist organisation was responsible for leading all of the violence, and they were going to get us. The funny thing was, drinking that night at the pub, a lot of us were going, we don't live in a fascist state. What are they going to do? We live in a liberal democracy. Well, we were a little naive at that. Of course, as the media pressure built up over the next couple of weeks, the police did take action. Yeah.
What were your memories of the rally, Marcus?
I don't have many memories of the rally because I don't have many.
Is that for legal purposes?
No, because I don't have many memories of. My memory's terrible, but I do remember a police horse that was just charging down Spring Street to the south, I think, riderless. A police officer had been pulled off that horse, and the police said that was the point when they had decided to give up and to release the prisoners. So that is burnt into my brain a bit.
I was just going to say, I have the same memory, except in my memory the horse ran down Lonsdale Street.
Oh, okay. Well, I would believe you, David, before I believed me. The instinct to surround that van I think, did come from ADEX too, because on the last day of the arms exhibition in Canberra, we were celebrating in the pub and heard that there was a couple of hundred of us there, and we heard that an Aboriginal man had been arrested and was in a divvy van, and everybody rocked out and released him, got him out of the divvy van. And so there's a tradition, you know, that was built up over that period of time with the Bush demonstrations and the Iraq War, that this is what the left did, and so that's what we did on the day.
Okay, well, a few days later, the police obviously thought they were going to get their revenge, and you were among 7 people who were arrested fairly early in the morning, I believe. Talk us through what it was like to be raided, and how come we're talking about the Austudy 5, not the Austudy 7?
I lived at home with my parents at the time, and when we had a bash on the door, I actually thought it was my then running partner trying to get me awake to get up and go running. I opened the door, 4 police are standing there shining a light into my face, and Mum and Dad, of course, got up, and I felt a bit stupid because the police officer said, "Hands behind your back," so I did, and he handcuffed me. It's like, damn it, I fell for that one. My parents got really emotional, and it shocked them, like, quite severely. Me, I was like, I've seen the media pressure build up, I suppose this was coming. They searched my room, and one of the striking things on the search warrant was they were looking for political literature. And they took all sorts of things from my room, but it was contradictory. So they left copies of The Socialists lying around, but they took a copy of an Age article about the Austudy protest I'd clipped and stuck on the wall. So the arrest warrant and the search warrant, I think, were a bit vague, which added, I think, to the political nature of the arrests in the end. Oh, the other funny thing was, when they asked my parents' occupation, they both said priest in the Anglican Church, right? And you could see the look on the police sergeant's face when they realised, we may have picked on the wrong political target. And indeed, later at the trial, I had a couple of priests lined up to give me character references, which was part of the defence campaign. That's how far it reached. Over the radio, as we made our way down to what was then Russell Street, the radio made it clear that I wasn't the only arrest. And it's like, I remember the last thing I said to Mum and Dad, who do we call? I gave them your phone number, Dave, and I said, ring David, let him know what's going on. And from there, obviously, you know, people understood. One interesting thing about the Austudy 7, I remember it being possibly a 6th arrest, but I'm happy to be corrected on this. But one of the other people arrested, Jill Sparrow, of course, is since a published author in her own right. Her flatmate, they lived above the fire station on Swanston Street, Alice, was targeted for arrest mistakenly because there was another person who hung around the protests who had a passing resemblance to Alice. And the police, though, when they met Alice, it's obviously the wrong person when you compare, but you can, if you'd ever seen Alice and this other person, you could see why the mistake would have been made. But they asked her in the end, are you a member of the ISO? And when she said no, it's like, we're not interested. So it was that emphasised to us on the mornings of the arrest just how targeted it was. But that also needs to be seen in the context of the repeated media claims or threats naming the International Socialist Organisation by name. So it was very obvious that the targeting was political. One more thing to add to that. We were often branded as outsiders somehow to the movement, but I think the police actually got these arrests correct because me, Jeff and Jill were absolutely the centre of the activism at Melbourne University. I mean, along with other activists. I don't want to claim credit but we were proud of our contributions to building that campaign. So they were correct in arresting the leadership of the campaign, but the political branding was something they layered on top of that to try to divide the movement.
So just for the record, we should say that the other 3 people, other than yourselves, were Jill Sparrow, who you've mentioned, who is, as you say, a published author, and is active in the Australian Services Union today. Her brother Jeff Sparrow, who people may not well know because he's a widely published author and commentator, and is, I believe, currently an academic at Melbourne University, and Mick Armstrong, who was and continues to be a socialist activist to this day. What did they say to you at the cop shop when you got to the Russell Street police station?
Apart from all of the formal bureaucracy, the first thing they did was show me video footage of myself, highlighted in a circle. Now, I was 21 at the time. This was only the second time I'd been arrested, and unlike the previous time, it's the first time I was by myself with a couple of police. It's intimidating, quite frankly. And when they had shown me the video footage, in which I was worried that maybe I'd been caught assaulting people or tearing things down, I didn't remember doing that, but you get nervous. It was just a video showing that I was there, right? Now, naively at the time, I then cooperated with police and gave them a fairly full statement of my activities, figuring I'd done nothing wrong. Now, to any activist listening to this, do not talk to the police about anything. Give no comment, right? If you give them anything, you don't, because then they revealed the charges to me, which were unlawful assembly, rescue of prisoners in lawful custody, and obstruct police. And I realised I'd just confessed, more or less, to all three of those things. Now, the unlawful assembly charge is a vague one. 3 or more people gathered together in such a manner that a person of reasonable courage could apprehend a breach of the peace. That's what it means. It's actually not legislated. It's a common law charge, which means there's no statutory maximum. The judge can set whatever sentence they think is appropriate. That is such a vague charge. A person of reasonable courage, of course, legally meaning a police officer. So as long as a police officer can testify they vaguely felt afraid by this group of 3 more people, you can be found guilty of that charge. Similarly, rescue of prisoners is unlawful custody. Well, we didn't. It's not like we got out a metal cutter and cut a hole in the side of the van and pulled people out, right?
But we would have if we could have.
We would have if we could have. But the act, of course, of surrounding the van, that's what they're talking about. And obstruct police. Well, yeah, we stopped a police van moving up the street. And so, yes, please, if you're ever in police custody, give no comment to everything. And if they insist on an answer like your name, just ask them, do I have to give you, and tell me where I have to give that information, right? And make them do it, because at least then, if you're forced to answer, your lawyers can later say that, well, the police told you the wrong thing, but no comment, yeah.
So, Marcus, what was your arrest experience like?
I can't remember, basically. I know that I wasn't an idiot like Jono, because because I'd been arrested quite a few times before that, at the Melbourne Club demonstrations in the early 80s against poverty and unemployment, and I was charged with a similar offence, but at a higher level, on riot, which was also a common law charge, that the police, it's not just reasonable courage, it's reasonable courage and character, and there's an assumption that police have character. But yes, I made no comments, and I was living in a share house at the time, and the police came in. I wasn't particularly upset. I expected that. That was on the 14th of April. The demonstration was on the 26th of March, and so it had taken that long for the media beat up and the police to get their shit together.
One other thing to add, it was the day before the next publicised rally about Austudy as well. So right. Clearly an act of intimidation. And
just there were 7 arrests from what I understood. 2 of those people were not in the International Socialists, and the police stupidly didn't in the end charge them. So it was restricted to the 5, the charges were laid against the 5 International Socialist members, which politically for the police was a big mistake. it made it very clear it was a political victimisation. Also, the police, I was reading stuff about Jill Sparrow's arrest, and she, in the Socialist, she was interviewed about what happened at her place. And it was, I think it's important to say that Alice was told that she wasn't targeted because her bust was too small, and that they told the friend he was lucky because the sluts were going to prison. So there was an element of sexism in the police arrests as well.
Let's move on to defending you guys, because in many ways that's the best part of the story. People have been arrested before, people have been charged, but it's a thorough defeat of the police, a political defeat in the court of public opinion and in the courts themselves that's really important. So how did the campaign get underway?
On the day of our arrests, we met at Melbourne University. So I wandered into campus wanting to find other activists, and there was a meeting of 25, 30 of us, something like that, and all people who'd been involved in the campaign. And the meeting was very clear right on the spot: we need to defend the arrestees. And I mean, I was still a bit shocked, having just been woken up early in the morning and questioned and all of that. But the instinct of the campaign was to double down on building the rally for the next day, and also to start a defence campaign. When you're in the middle of this, you're not clear necessarily on exactly what needs to be done. But certainly the first instinct of everyone present was to start reaching out for solidarity and spread the word, and start using the arrests to make sure we had a good rally the following day. The rally the following day, it wasn't as big as about the 3,000 people at the March rally. So the April rally was maybe a couple of thousand people, but certainly I think we could put that down maybe to not building as well, second time around, activists, etc. People weren't intimidated, it's absolutely clear. I spoke to that rally, and I told them, and I still stand by this, that I was very, very proud to stand with people who refused to be intimidated. We marched to Parliament again and made the political points about Austudy that we've made at the beginning of this podcast. And I also liked the way in which the campaign built from there under the direct influence of the politics of the International Socialist Organisation. So the most important political thing was that we needed to reach out to the union movement, because it's workers who have the power to change society. And when unions in Australia move on an issue, things happen about the issue. And so we made it our business to, of course, approach student unions and other activist bodies. We started immediately a sign-on list to defend the Austudy 5 and drop the charges. And we started working almost straight away from that point to start contacting union leaderships, but also to start passing rank and file motions. And I think Marcus has got more to say about that.
Yeah, the speed was important. Like in that first week, the politics was that the Austudy campaign was a national campaign, and so that there was Jill Sparrow went up in the first week after her arrest to University of Sydney and addressed a student general meeting. She also spoke to the activists at University of Technology Sydney and Western Sydney University. In Adelaide, there was Flinders University Education Action Group, and got involved and showed support. But there was 350 letters sent out to Labor Party branches in Victoria and to trade union organisations. And so that politics of the United Front approach of getting official labour movement and student movement endorsements of the campaign started immediately. And the corollary of that is that the grassroots campaigning from below, with the rank and file union delegates, hundreds of union delegates started to get involved in terms of at least endorsing the campaign. that dual strategy of working from below to put pressure on the officials and on the Labor Party branches and the Labor Party itself started immediately. And that politics is part of the revolutionary tradition that Jono and I and David are in, and it certainly helped. This is not an exercise in bragging. This is an exercise in arguing what has to happen when you defend the right to protest. And this discussion around Austudy 5 campaign is an example of that. And that's the purpose, from my point of view, about why we're talking today.
Can you give us a bit of a flavour, Marcus? Because I know you've gone back through the socialist paper from the time, the predecessor to Solidarity magazine. Can you give us a bit of a flavour of who ended up endorsing the campaign? Because it's actually, I think, even now, looking back, quite impressive.
Yeah, there was, it's a 2.5 year campaign, and we approached a lot of people, and the approach, the Austudy 5 campaign was featured in every issue of our, I think they were monthly papers then, for that 2.5 year period. And so we'd have interviews by the Assistant State Secretary of the ETU, Gary Main. Anyway, we have these officials with their photos and them saying why they support the Austudy 5, why they defend the right to protest, because that was the slogan that the campaign worked off. Defend the Austudy 5 - defend the right to protest. And so that was a consistent message. We linked that always in the process. So, but we'd also, before I go on to how many official endorsements we got at the end, there was also the equal focus, in fact more important focus, on the grassroots activity from below. And we'd talk about, some assistant union delegate, I think at an abattoir, there was police violence there, and that he was showing support for the Austudy 5 and calling on members to endorse it. That there was a baggage handler, I think, at the Melbourne airport who saw a bunch of people wearing Defend the Austudy 5 t-shirts, and he'd been a student, and he wrote a letter to the Socialist saying that he was going to raise this in the Federated Clerks Union with his fellow union members. And so that was always seen as what needed to happen as well. In the end, I just counted, because I had to trawl through the Socialists because my memory's not that good, and counted that there were over 24 official endorsements from union branches across the country. Many blue-collar unions endorsed it, and the ACT Trades and Labour Council endorsed the campaign. Many gave donations as well with their endorsements. And then there was a heap of Labor MPs, and fun fact, Anthony Albanese signed that in support for that petition in 1993, I think it was, at a New South Wales State ALP conference thing, where we got 6 pages of petitions at the State ALP conference, and his name was there along with a series of other MPs. And John Pilger and all these celebrities that people focus on today were endorsing the campaign. I want to stress that there were hundreds of union delegates and deputy union delegates and OH&S reps and individual union members who identified themselves as union members who also endorsed the campaign. So it was a thing. It was a big thing around the left and broadening out beyond the left, in a sense, by the end of that 2.5 year campaign, which put immense political pressure on the government at the time and the prosecution.
Can I just add to that? One important endorsement from the ALP's MPs in Parliament was Neil Cole, who was the Shadow Labor Attorney General at the time. I can't believe the Shadow Labor Attorney General would endorse something like that nowadays, with the current mob. Really significant, and that plays to what Marcus is saying, or endorses what Marcus is saying about the pressure and the common sense it became to defend the Austudy 5 because of how broad and both approaching the Labor leadership and the union leadership and rank and filers made it, turned it into a big campaign. I think Both of those ingredients are crucial. The rank and file is more important, but it's a lot easier to approach a workplace when their union leadership has already endorsed a campaign and creating activism. One other celebrity endorsement I'll throw in, Genevieve Pico endorsed the campaign, gave us a lovely statement in support.
And she's an actor.
Genevieve Pico, the actor, yes.
I think part of my memory of this was that we were everywhere. We had T-shirts, we had badges, we had posters, we protested outside every committal hearing, and anybody who knows the legal process knows that there are many appearances in court long before the actual rubber hits the road on the case itself. We were always there in numbers. And 30 odd years ago, without the internet, when we did fundraising, it wasn't running a chuffed fundraiser. We ran trivia nights and quiz nights and so on, which meant they themselves became part of the political mobilisation. It wasn't just the money that came from it, it was also the politics of people coming along and participating. The one thing I would say in relation to the Labour MPs, and I believe there were 2 federal Labour MPs and 4 state MPs, is that today I think that would be next to impossible. The shift to the right and the bureaucratisation of the Labour Party would make that highly unlikely, not necessarily impossible, but highly unlikely. But the orientation towards getting people from the Labour Party involved in the campaign is still very valid. And you look at the number of Labour Party branches who have come out against AUKUS or who have come out in support of Palestine, and the idea that you can simply ignore people in the Labour Party if you're building a broad campaign. It wasn't true in 1992, 93, and it wouldn't be true today. You finally faced the County Court on the 29th of August 1994, and there were between 400 and 500 people outside the court in your support. That's at 9 o'clock on a weekday. And I've been to other solidarity protests outside courts at that sort of time, and a turnout of 50 is usually seen as very, very good. There were representatives of union branches, and there were 4 Labour MPs in the crowd, including people who spoke. And I have a very clear memory of the prosecutor entering the court sort of through the crowd, looking around and saying, who are these people here for? Being told it was the Austudy 5 and going, we've got a problem, and going into the court. You can take us through the court proceedings. How did you feel, given that you were facing reasonably serious charges? What was it like to see 400 or 500 people outside the court that morning?
Oh, so important for us. Important enough that personally, whenever I hear about solidarity protests, and it brings tears to my eyes, because I know personally how important it was to feel supported, to hear those chants from the outside. The story about the DPP at the time, Buongiorno was his name, he was mates with Neil Cole, who, as we said, endorsed the Austudy 5 campaign. Neil Cole turned up to speak in support of us to that rally. And I have a clear memory, because before we went in, we heard the speakers, the 5 of us. I have a clear memory of when Neil Cole picked up the microphone, the TV cameras all lifted and the microphone started pointing. And that was part of the importance of getting political expression to the pressure of the campaign. The Shadow Labor Attorney General was going to speak to the protest. And of course he spoke really well in support of us. He told us the story later that Buongiorno approached him and said, hey, you here for this Austudy 5 business? He goes, oh yeah, defend the Austudy 5, the right to protest, of course I'm here. Buongiorno literally says, just according to Neil, oh shit, and then ran into the courtroom. Now, the way it worked out in the courtroom there later, it was actually Mick who spoke first, because he went unrepresented when the judge said, is there any issues you'd like to raise? And Mick it was who actually raised the issue that the footage that they were presenting as evidence had been edited together by the police, and our faces highlighted with a little bright circle. And he simply pointed out that the way that evidence was constructed overemphasises our role in a demonstration simply through an act of editing. The judge then agrees to review the footage. It's like, okay. The judge goes away, has talks probably with the DPP, I don't know in the background to be honest, but after a period of time where we're nervously pacing, comes back and says, okay, I've reviewed the footage, the actions of all 5 of you aren't really that bad. Words to that effect from the judge, I was like, oh, see? And he then said, surely we can strike some sort of deal. Now, I want to emphasise under Australian law, plea deals are actually not a thing, right? Officially. But of course, politically they are. Now, the one sticking point was one of the charges that related to the police officer being pulled off their horse. At an earlier court hearing, the police officer who was pulled off their horse, one of the Austudy 5, I won't say who, was charged with assault and battery in relation to what happened. The police officer concerned on the stand at the committal hearing confessed that he wasn't injured, right? That in fact he got up and started running after his horse. Well, that meant they had to drop the charge of battery. So assault still remained though. And when the prosecuting lawyer through our attorneys said, if you plead guilty to obstruct and to the assault charge, we'll drop the others. We actually said, no, you're going to drop the assault as well. And while they hesitated at that, they did drop the assault charge as well. And that speaks to the strength of the campaign, the confidence we felt to make that demand of the prosecutor, and the strength of the political campaign. And I think that little apex moment was Neil Cole as Shadow Labor Attorney General speaking to the crowd, which immediately expressed that. So we pleaded guilty to obstruct police through gritted teeth and had to serve, in common parlance, it is called 2 years good behaviour, but basically as long as we didn't come to the attention of police. So that meant that couldn't go bill postering for a couple of years and stuff like that. Then we'd be fine, which we were.
And no conviction was recorded. What's your memory? And I know you've said your memory's not that good, but to the extent to which you have a memory of the court case unfolding, what was it?
Pride. Initially, people at my work at Brunswick CES came along, and that was a weekday. They knew that my job, I was threatened with the sack, and we'd been organising in the previous year, over 24 of us, around the my defence campaign at work, as well as the legal, the charges. And they were totally invested, and so they basically, they can go on strike, but they can go to work. They came along and showed support. So I was really touched by that. And so our campaign in the previous year, we've been going to various delegates meetings, handing out leaflets and stuff. And we had resistance from our Victorian branch officials. They would not endorse the campaign, whereas the New South Wales CPSU officials the branch had, and the ACT branch had, through pressure from our comrades and other activists to do that. But it was a mixed blessing for our officials in Victoria, because we have actually helped build a rank and file group in many ways, and we had links there that we won battles over the following EBA rounds because they had more trust in the revolutionaries than they did in these left reformists that were around at the time. So I do remember that. We won it politically. We didn't win it legally. Yeah. We were guilty legally.
Technically under the law.
I think the statute of limitations has long since passed.
So, but I mean, it was seen as being when you defend the right to protest or defend people against charges, you have to around these type of political charges, then you do need to mount a political campaign, and not just a legal campaign. Yep. And 200 people were arrested at ADEX, but there wasn't a campaign around that, and so people just had to cop it. I think we're going to talk a bit about the Defend Land Forces stuff later, but there hasn't been, to be honest, a political campaign to defend those arrested so far. And that was the key thing. I remember my lawyer, Len Hartnett, talking to various union officials. He was a Red Maoist, and and he was talking to various officials and putting pressure on in different ways on the Victorian government, but also on the DPP, the Director of Public Prosecutions, Bongiorno, who was a Labor appointee, who retained his position when Kennett got elected, the Kennett government got elected. So it was the pressure on Bongiorno, I think, was the thing that won it for us.
We'll move on more to the lessons now, but as you say, there's been more than 100 people arrested, sometimes in quite similar circumstances to you guys. Early in the morning, mass turn up of cops at the door, going through people's personal items and the like. And those people were arrested allegedly in connection with the protest at Disrupt Land Forces. So we'll now move on to what lessons can be learnt for those who've been arrested around Disrupt Land Forces, and there will be other arrests around political activity in the future. Before we get down to the serious stuff, I should just say that I learned one lesson when we went to the pub to celebrate. We made the rookie mistake of starting with the cheap champagne, and when they ran out, moved on to the expensive stuff, by which time your sense of taste is completely gone and you're wasting your money. So if and when people win their next campaign, celebrate with the expensive stuff and enjoy it and get your money's worth. Now, on a more serious note, what can we say to comrades facing charges around DLF?
I have listened to comrades who face charges at the Palestine rallies. They've spoken to the rallies about what happened at the Defence exhibition here in Melbourne. And they've expressed their moral outrage, and I think that's right. It is absolutely outrageous that dawn raids happened, especially when at that rally the police were provocative, not just provocative in fact, they went beyond that. They went there prepared to break heads with modern weapons, and the modern militarisation of the police force, while the violence we faced, chokeholds, punching, pushing, shoving, tackling, was fairly shocking at the Austudy 5, rubber bullets and tear gas were used in Melbourne. And I've previously experienced such things back in the late 90s when I was in Palestine for several months. And the excess of violence against the protesters was quite shocking. But we need to move beyond the shock and the outrage, and we need to start thinking strategically. And for me, the key lesson of the Austudy 5 campaign, first of all, there needs to be a public campaign. It needs to elect some kind of ongoing committee, or people need to volunteer to take on the work. We need to start going and getting endorsements and patiently having the political arguments, because the mass media in the wake of the DLF played the same script they did in the wake of our original demonstration back in March 1992. Same script. There are a limited number of violent offenders. The police should go after them. This is shocking in Melbourne. They blamed the protesters for the violence at every step of the way, when clearly the police turned up fully armed and prepared to use their weapons. And that political education needs to happen in concert with I think appeals to, as we did in the Austudy 5, union leaderships, and we need to be part of educating them. When they rebuff us, or if they endorse us even better, we also go to rank and file groups and start getting motions passed, and we also start going to any activist group and getting political education work and endorsements and money, if whatever people can spare, so that we can solve practical problems like legal fees, support for those who have been charged. I may not be fully informed of everything that's going on around defending those activists, but I haven't seen a public campaign to defend the activists concerned, and I think we should have one, and that's the principal lesson for me.
Just for the record, there was a rally outside the first court appearance, and there was an online petition and fundraising. But yes, it's clearly nothing like the kind of campaign that you two have outlined around the Austudy 5. Marcus, your final thoughts?
Yeah, there were 30,000 people signed the petition that was tabled. It was sent to Jacinta Allen's government, Labor government in Victoria, protesting about the breaches to human rights. So the campaign did that. The Disrupt Land Forces Defence did that, and so that was really good. But it was legal. It was all about human rights and about not the need to resist the militarisation of the police or the right to protest more generally, not linking it into the struggles in the Palestine movement, not linking it in to the struggles in the CFMEU at the moment and the attacks in the CFMEU. And so it's a more difficult period at one level to be able to connect. The trade union movement is weaker now than it was in the 90s. But the point still remains, that the social movements then around, the AIDEX arms exhibition, the Gulf War, the Bush demonstrations, have got an echo today, especially with the Palestine movement. And there's been rank and file groups developed in the trade unions around supporting Palestine. But the issue of the DLF, defending the DLF, or defending the right to protest on the streets and in the workplaces, there's an avenue and a venue to do that built by the resistance to the genocide. That hasn't been taken up, and the ongoing attacks on the right to protest and on the trade union movement. The attacks on the social movements and the trade union movement aren't going away. And so the opportunity to connect the defending the DLF protests is an ongoing possibility. And we need, there'll be further arrests, but we need to have a general strategic orientation to a united front that allows that possibility. The conditions, whatever the conditions of that possibility are, to allow for those conditions, those possibilities to be maximised by talking to the official structures of the social movements and the trade union movements and linking it in to the rank and file activity. And so that's the political argument that needs to be made. We can't just ignore or moralise against what's going on. We have to fight back in a way that's going to put pressure on them and building our workplaces while we're doing it.
All right. Well, thank you to both of you for your time, for your memories, even if somewhat partial, but for your memories and for your research going back into events that took place 32, 33 years ago. I've found it fascinating, and I think it's full of lessons for today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.